men go through andropause and they have this much more gradual drop in sex hormones, and women just fall off a cliff.
Welcome to the Dutch Podcast, where we dive deep into the science of hormones, wellness, and personalized healthcare. I'm Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton, Chief Medical Officer at Dutch. Join us every Tuesday as we bring you expert insights, cutting-edge research, and practical tips to help you take control of your health from the inside out. Whether you're a healthcare professional or simply looking to optimize your own well-being, we've got you covered. The contents of this podcast are for educational and informational purposes only. This information is not to be interpreted or mistaken for medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of the Dutch Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to talk about a topic today that affects so many people, not just patients, but families of patients, caregivers of patients, friends of patients. And that topic is really about brain health, Alzheimer's disease, and cognitive decline. Now, you might think, why is this something that we would be talking about on the Dutch Podcast? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, hormones are a big component, particularly for women. We know 65% of patients with dementia are women, and there's absolutely a hormonal component. But this really gets to many of the root causes that can contribute to an environment where brain health is not optimized. Today's guest is a naturopathic doctor who's really committed her career to this and has a tremendous amount of experience over the last decade building a collaborative medical approach to brain health. Dr. Heather Sandison, she's a New York Times bestselling author of Reversing Alzheimer's, the new toolkit to improve cognition and protect brain health. She's a renowned naturopathic doctor who specializes in neurocognitive medicine and the founder of Solsere Health Clinic, a premier brain optimization clinic based in San Diego. She trained under Dale Bredesen, who many of you may know, Dr. Bredesen and the Bredesen Protocol. Dr. Sandison is dedicated to supporting those suffering with dementia. She's also the primary author of peer-reviewed research published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. She is really shattering the common misconceptions about Alzheimer's and teaching lifestyle change-based protocols that keep your brain sharp at any age. If you think you're too young to be thinking about this, she's going to convince you otherwise. So let's go ahead and dive in. Well, Dr. Sandison, I'm really excited about our topic today. And I think it's something that, for our middle-aged audience, it's probably a mix of people, whether they're thinking about this actively right now or not, right? Or maybe they have a parent or someone they care for and it's kind of hitting them in their life. Or maybe they're just thinking about their own health long-term. But this is a topic we haven't really covered on the Dutch Podcast, but it's one that affects so many people. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a privilege. I know for most of us, the thought of losing your mind as you age is our biggest fear. So I think it's an important conversation.
Totally. Well, can you start by just sharing a little bit about yourselves? I always love starting with this. How did you find naturopathic medicine? And then more specifically, how did you find your way into neurocognitive medicine?
Yeah, really on accident. I had always wanted to go into medicine. I think having this idea that when people are at their healthiest, they can contribute to society, right? They can show up at neighborhood board meetings and they can help with their grandchildren and they're contributing. I think we all have that inherent human need to feel like we're contributing. And if we're sick, it's really hard, right? If you're running around to doctor's appointments or if you're struggling with fatigue or cognitive changes or chronic pain, whatever it is, whatever ailment it is, it's really hard to engage fully. It's really hard to be yourself and be present. And so that's how I've always thought of myself is I want to be a provider who can help other people live their lives to the fullest. And I imagined going to conventional medical school. I have several family members who are in the medical field. And I went to San Francisco thinking I would go to UCSF, the best medical school on the West Coast. And I met Sally Lamont, a colleague of ours, through an Introduction to Naturopathic Medicine course. And when the first day in the course, I was just like, wait, what? Somebody else has thought of this too? This idea that you can approach health and wellness. You can use medicine to promote people living their optimal lives versus having just tools of pharmaceuticals and surgery and really focusing on the disease process versus what creates health. I was just so much more interested in the latter. I was so much more interested in health and well-being. And so knowing that there was this path, it became just a matter of when, not if. I felt once I had met Dr. Lamont, and been introduced to these concepts of treating the cause, treating the root cause, and supporting doctor as teacher, rather it's as like this kind of patriarchal, like I'm the one in charge and you will do what I say, but really thinking of it as collaborative medicine and using these tenets of naturopathic medicine. It spoke to me. I was like, yes, this is it. And then the way I
Yeah.
found neurocognitive medicine, I was taught, I'm sure as you were, as all of us were at that time, and maybe many still are taught, is that there was nothing you could do for somebody struggling with Alzheimer's or dementia. That to suggest that you could was actually to do harm, was to give people false hope. And that was, I bought it. I was told that by well-meaning, very well-educated instructors. And then a couple years after getting out of school, I was at a conference. It was integrative medicine for mental health, IMMH, and Dr. Bredesen, my now mentor, was speaking there, and he was describing essentially stacking everything I had learned in school, all of naturopathic medicine, and applying it to people with cognitive changes, age-related memory loss, and seeing their cognition improve. And so I was like, well, that, I was told that wasn't possible, that we shouldn't say that we can help those people. But I was intrigued because it made conceptual sense to me, right? This idea that if you have a cell in the body, whether it's a neuron or a heart cell or your big toe, right? Like if you have a cell in the body and you take all the junk out of the way and you give it what it needs to thrive, you have a better functioning cell. And neurons are no different from the rest of the body in that way. And so that, I think, hearing that, it was kind of another aha moment. Like when I was in Sally Lamont's class, it was like, yeah, of course. Like, why would we think that it's any different? And so when he was describing these cases of people improving, I was like, I need to learn more about this, because this was my ego, of course. And then was like, well, if I could treat somebody with dementia, then what, everything else would be easy. Like that would be amazing. So I went ahead and did his course, learned from Dr. Bredesen, became certified right, and this was just a timing thing, was I did that right in September of 2017 as his book was being published. And I was then the only person in San Diego who had the training, and I had a lot of people showing up. And I had no confidence at that point that I could help, because there was still that voice in the back of my head saying there's nothing we could do. But I watched people get better over, not just once, but over and over and over. And of course, we still have those moments where I'm like, am I helping anyone? I guess nobody's getting better this week. But then the next week, it's like everybody is improving their cognitive scores. And, we have our patients saying that, and their caregivers saying, I got my husband back, I got my wife back, I got my mom back. And that just makes all of it worthwhile.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I can tell we're going to have a juicy conversation today. There's so much that I want to say already, but I think that concept of like, there's nothing you can do about this. I think it's really, I think naturopathic medicine, which is uniquely different from biohacking, right? We're not biohacking our way to health. I think it's a fundamentally different approach. But the thing that came to mind for me was like, people who suffer with illnesses like cognitive decline, for a long time, you feel like you're a random victim, like you're a targeted victim, like of a robbery, right? It's just as random. And you could say the same thing for infertility. You could say the same thing for cancer, that are, because we had this lack of understanding of kind of the root drivers and this feeling like there's nothing you can do, it creates a really challenging situation where people feel like for a long time, that it was just some kind of like random victimization. But of course, that makes no sense from a medical perspective.
Julie G on Dr. Bredesen's team, she calls it false hopelessness, right? Like,
I love that.
It was like this accusation that, oh, you're giving people false hope for a while or whatever. It's hyperbole. I mean, I get it. Like everyone's scared in this situation, and like billions of dollars have been spent and countless hours of many smart people's time trying to figure this out from this pharmaceutical perspective. It's not for lack of trying. And they want to, there's motivation to defend the amyloid hypothesis and all of that. I get it. And to say that there's nothing that we can do and that there isn't hope is perpetuating a disease process, because there is so much we know. There's an overwhelming amount that we know at this point about how we can mitigate our risk, how we can absolutely prevent, delay, and even, yes, reverse this awful disease process.
So, can we start at the beginning? Really, for me, because I'm not an expert in this area, and for others, like when you look at cognitive decline or Alzheimer's, when you look at this from a 50,000-foot view, what's happening in the brain?
Yeah, so I think framework is good. So thank you. I'm not going to answer exactly your question, but we're going to get there.
Great.
So what's happening? So if we zoom out, what is our framework for how we approach any complex disease, right? So complex system science is essentially what naturopathic medicine is for the body, and we're going to talk about this in relationship to the brain. But you can apply these sort of concepts to any complex system, right? Whether it's an ecosystem or it's a financial system or an education system or whatever it is, you can think through complex systems science because there's secondary effects and tertiary effects, right? Like there's feedback loops. So they are complex, but they don't have to be overly complicated. What we want to do is think about causal level drivers of imbalance. And so we talk about balance a lot in the body, but imbalance, what we're looking for is at these causal levels, we want to know if there are things that are not in the right place, that are not happening at the right time, and if there's too much or too little of them, right? So if you have imbalance in a complex system, you are going to get dysfunction. And in this case, that means neurodegeneration, right? If we're talking about the brain. So that might be Parkinson's or MS or Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia, right? It could be many, many things, could manifest as different things. But if you have imbalance in the system, that is where function is headed out, right? It is headed towards degeneration, dysfunction.
Can I pause you for just a minute? Because I want to offer a reframe. And I think this is an interesting way to think about it. Because I think you're right. When the system is out of balance, there's there's adaptation that happens. It's like the body is trying to restore balance. And I think about this with a model that a lot of people understand with blood sugar imbalance, where you have this like rising blood sugar causing high insulin, and then you get this adaptation downstream where the cells become insulin resistant, and that is part of a disease state. What it actually is a cell protection mechanism because they're being bombarded with insulin for such a long period of time. So I put that out there because I think for people, when we talk about dysfunctional systems, I like to try to reframe it a little bit where like our body is so smart, it's trying to constantly adapt to really a bad environment. I don't know if you'd accept that or, you agree with that in this kind of circumstance.
Well, absolutely 100% because amyloid plaque, right? Many people say amyloid plaque is the cause of Alzheimer's or misfolded proteins. Tau is the cause of Alzheimer's. Well, lo and behold, they are antimicrobial. They are there to protect us, right? So they are part of that adaptive system. And if you get rid of them, which we're very good at that from a pharmaceutical perspective, we can get rid of amyloid, we can take that out of the brain, but you don't end up with better cognition. So what we need to do is say, what caused the amyloid? Sometimes even in the functional medicine world, naturopathic world, I'll hear people say, well, Alzheimer's is caused by inflammation. But what caused the inflammation? So if we're constantly asking the question, like what's upstream from that, then you're going to, that's where I like to play, right? So if we're looking for imbalances, it's like, okay, and what? It's not an inflammation. I mean, that's interesting, but it's less interesting to me than whatever caused the inflammation. If we're looking for imbalances, it's not an amyloid plaque production. It's what caused the amyloid plaque production, right? So, and thyroid, I would say too, is secondary. For the thyroid doesn't go out of balance on its own. Something pushes it. So
Right.
what's interesting is what pushed it out of balance. And that's where I think it's helpful to define what are these causal level factors. And I would argue that for the human body, including the brain, the causal level factors are imbalances in toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure, signaling, and infections. And if we systematically go through those things and evaluate for balance, then we will find imbalances. If you look, you will find them. And when we correct for that, when we gently nudge the body back into, and this is all homeodynamic, right? Like this is not about static. This is not about stasis. This is about, rhythms. And like if something's too much, too little in the wrong place, if you have too much cortisol at night and too little melatonin, you're not going to sleep, which is going to cause a stressor on the system. It's going to keep you from getting the deep sleep that you need for the glymphatic rinsing of the brain. And you're going to end up with too many toxins, whether they're metabolic or mercury or mycotoxins in the brain, leading to microglial activation, right? But it's not the microglia's fault. it's this imbalance in the ability to sleep and get that deep sleep. So we can talk through this, and again, there's many feedback loops.
Yeah. I love that you're raising this because this is ultimately like the fundamental difference in approach, or this understanding leads to the fundamental difference in approach between a conventional and a naturopathic, in particular naturopathic medicine, which I think is like a unique, distinct from even an integrative or functional medicine perspective. But there's this questioning of the changes that are observed. And I think what we see in the classic drug model, which I came from, that was what I did before med school, was you find out what's different between healthy and abnormal, or healthy and disease, and then you figure out what that is and you target that molecule or you target that change, and in hopes to see disease regression. But what that fails to do is look at the environment that created that change in the first place. I love that you're talking about these. Can you repeat again what those big kind of list of things you've talked about: toxins, nutrients?
Yeah, and happy to dive into any of them more. I know
We will.
the
I'd like
Dutch
to.
conversation,
Yeah.
there's always this signaling around hormones is a big part of what we're doing. So toxins, and we think of toxins in essentially in three flavors that we can test for, which is heavy metals, mycotoxins, biotoxins, and then chemical toxicity. And then using specific binders, specific protocols and strategies to be precise about how we get those out, but also just turning up the volume on our natural detox processes through our organs of elimination. And then with nutrients, we can think both macro and micro, right? We've got our micronutrients, our minerals and our B vitamins, and those are going to be different for different people. Some people need more methyl donors than the next. Some people burn through B vitamins quicker than the others. Some people need more magnesium, right? So, and then we have our macronutrients, of course, our protein, carbs, and fats. And you mentioned diabetes and insulin resistance. Sometimes you'll hear Alzheimer's referred to as type 3 diabetes. Certainly having elevated blood sugar, dysregulated blood sugar, puts you at risk for developing dementia over time. Having all of us, no matter what our diabetes status, as we age, we aren't as good at turning sugar into fuel in the brain as we were when we were younger. Even if we don't have diabetes or any insulin resistance, it's just part of aging. And we create a lot of oxidative stress when we use sugar for fuel in the brain. The brain, in very rare research scenarios where there's both ketones and sugar available to the brain will preferentially burn ketones. And many people have the experience of getting into ketosis, whether it's dietary ketosis or using exogenous ketones, feeling like their brain turns on. It's essentially just a fuel that burns cleaner, and we feel sharper when we're burning ketones instead of sugar for fuel. Again, regardless of diabetes status. But a ketogenic diet is a great way also to address diabetes. So we're proponents of that, not forever, not that someone be in ketosis forever, but that if anyone's struggling with cognitive changes, that you at least try a ketogenic diet and use exogenous ketones if you can't for any reason get into ketosis, and see if that helps to kind of turn on and activate and get the brain more energy. So toxins, nutrients, stressors. Stressors go both ways. Again, balance, right? If you have too little stress, this can be like that idea of kicking your feet up, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, kind of as a retirement plan. That leads, there's nothing to push against. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So if there isn't a purpose, meaning, a reason to get up out of bed in the morning, if there isn't a reason to create some kind of structure, if you're not getting enough exercise, if there aren't periods of fasting, if it's just all abundance and kind of trending towards gluttony, we are going to experience issues. There's going to be problems. And we're not going to we don't get that benefit of the hormetic effect, right? When we stress the system, we get more resilience. And if we lose that after 65, our brain is going to deteriorate. On the flip side, we see the data shows that people who serve as care partners for someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, they're anywhere from 2.5 to 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with dementia themselves, to become the patient.
Wow. That's amazing. And they think that's attributed to the tremendous stress involved, or maybe living in the same environment, probably a lot of factors.
Yeah, I suspect that it's largely due to the stress. We see that the highest rates are in the male partners and the husbands of a wife with Alzheimer's. And Of course, this is affecting often people's sleep rhythms, their ability to exercise themselves, to make good food choices, and then they're going through the micro grief of losing a partner
Mm.
each day. Yeah, I think there's extremely high stress with caregiving, and so we can certainly have too much stress, long-term sleep deprivation, cortisol is literally toxic to the hippocampus over time. So we see that if there's too high cortisol levels, if they don't come down overnight, if they stay perpetually high, then the hippocampus, that memory center of the brain, will shrink. So yeah, we can have stress on either side. We want enough, but not too much. And
Mm.
then, so toxins, nutrients, stress, structure. Structure, like nutrients, comes in micro and macro. So micro structure is our genetics. Our ApoE status is part of that. PSIN1, PSIN2, and APP, those are early onset Alzheimer's genetics, and we certainly work with some of those patients. But the vast majority of our patients are ApoE4 positive. They have either one or two copies, and this puts them at higher risk for developing dementia. We can't change that. That's not a
Mm.
modifiable risk factor. However, for someone who knows, people 10, 12 years ago used to say, why would I get that tested? It's just going to keep me from sleeping. That's going to increase my dementia risk, right? Totally made sense 10 or 12 years ago. But now, if I have a patient who's ApoE4 and they have children, if your kids are thinking about what they're going to do for work, and we can, if they're going to college and binge drinking, right, we might want to know their status so that they can have more agency around different career decisions, maybe different sports even.
Wow, I would never even think about that. Like avoiding head trauma. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, yeah. If I had a child who was ApoE4 positive, there is no way I would let them go anywhere near football, soccer, big wave surfing. I mean, anything, riding motorcycles. I mean, I wouldn't do.
Mm.
My kids aren't allowed to do that, anyways. But you can think about that risk very differently, because if you're ApoE4 positive, you're going to create amyloid plaque faster than your neighbor who's not, right? And even in the teens, we see people who are ApoE4 positive compared to those who are not, already have cognitive differences. So it is something that where we can start making decisions a lot earlier in life to protect brain health and risk in at-risk individuals.
I love that you pulled this in because I do think that, we went through a kind of a trend in time, probably in the 90s, where we thought every disease would be traced to its genetic origin. We'd create a drug to modify the genome, the diseases would go away. It's obviously more complex than that. But it did. It was like if you had, look at the trending that happened with 23andMe. People got it. They were talking about disease risk. They had to pull that down because, again, it would cause people stress and strain if they could do nothing about it. But I love the way that you're reframing this, which is that you can't change the book. You can't change the genes, but you can definitely change the environment that you're living in to optimize your genome. And that probably includes not just avoidance of potentially dangerous activities, but probably the nutritional status and things like that as well to try to work around. You get what you get, but you got to work around it.
Yeah. You play the cards you're dealt. So the other piece of structure is the macrostructure, and this comes up in a few different places. It's the plumbing, right? Like, is the airway open at night? Or
Mm-hmm.
we see that sleep apnea, even mild sleep apnea, has a very big impact on cognition. And so that's really like one of those big places where we start is making sure that there's no OSA, obstructive sleep apnea. And then also, blood flow. Can blood get up to your brain and out of your brain, or are there plaques? That comes with exercise. Are you pumping that system? Are you getting
Mm-hmm.
enough blood for the brain? Another place that the macrostructure comes up is is the hip bone connected to the leg bone, right? Or do you have sciatica, and that keeps you from sleeping at night? You're in chronic pain, you can't exercise. These are all things that have a big impact on dementia risk and how we age generally, and whether or not we're able to engage in the things that will help us to reduce our risk and help us thrive, right? Not just reduce our
Mm-hmm.
risk and not get Alzheimer's, but like help us to enjoy the last quarter of life. And then, so toxins, nutrients, stressors, structure, signaling. I hope we'll dive in. Actually, maybe I'll do infections first, because then we can like have a big conversation around signaling. So
Okay.
infections, I put these towards the end often because if we can get everything else dialed, if you got nutrients under control and those are balanced, and you've got the toxins down, and you've got your stressors dialed, and you're getting exercise, you're sleeping at night, well, then your immune system takes care of a lot, right? We don't have to do quite so much. However, we see lots of people who have P. gingivalis, who have gum disease. P. gingivalis has been found in the plaques and tangles on autopsy of people with Alzheimer's and dementia. So we know that amyloid is being created in response to gum disease. We also know that amyloid is created in response to Lyme spirochetes. And so Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia, the Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, these are tick-borne diseases that can have an impact. We know especially Lyme, the Lyme spirochetes, there's a neuro-Lyme manifestation, just like a syphilis. They're these similar spirochete forms, and they can have a huge impact on cognition. And Richard Horowitz has published on people with diagnosed Alzheimer's improving cognition with his treatments, and we see this pop up.
Can we stop for a second, though? Because I think this is worth repeating. I mean, I think, so what you're saying here is that the brain is a microbiome in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be right back with more. If you're already running Dutch tests in your practice or thinking about it, there's never been a better time to become an official Dutch provider. Why? Because we go beyond lab testing. Our provider community gets exclusive access to clinical education, in-depth report interpretation, training, monthly case reviews, and one-on-one clinical support. Whether you're just getting started or looking to sharpen your functional hormone expertise, we give you the tools to grow. Join thousands of providers already making a difference. Visit DutchTest.com today. Welcome back to the Dutch Podcast.
We've talked a lot about microbiomes, but I don't think we've talked about the brain microbiome. So that's one thing. If you can maybe touch upon that a bit more before we dive into signaling. Mm-hmm. But then also the thought that things could migrate, like from the gums into the brain through the blood-brain barrier, that's probably a surprise to a lot of people that are listening.
Yeah, so there's basically 4 or 5 microbes that we know have an outsized impact on cognition. And they are the gum disease, so it's not just P. gingivalis, there's several others whose names I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but that they basically are triggering inflammation in the brain quickly. And this happens, I measure LPPLA2, I don't know if you do in your practice, but that is associated with heart disease, cardiovascular risk.
Exactly.
That's essentially what it
That's one of the first tie that was made between, dental and periodontal health.
Yeah, well, what we see is it's also related to cognitive health. So it's increasing risk in both cardiovascular and cognitive arenas. And it's when you introduce those bacteria into the bloodstream, they're going to the brain, right? It's in the bloodstream. The brain is not sterile. I think that's pretty well established. We don't know a lot about, the good bugs, good brain bugs. Like we talk about good gut bugs, good even sinus bugs, vaginal flora and all of those things where there's skin, we think about good bugs, but I think in the brain, we really haven't had that conversation. And I hope that that's something that we will start to talk about because I think it's important. Right now, kind of the focus of that conversation is on which pathogens trigger that amyloid production. And that is P. gingivalis and the other microbes associated with gingivitis, Lyme spirochetes, herpes, HSV1, which is responsible for cold sores. So we see, and this is very well established in sort of epidemiological data, and that if you aggressively treat HSV1, if you're someone who's prone to cold sores and you take the prescription antivirals, and also I think my suggestion is if you're prone to those, take a lot of lysine. You can just put scoops of that into whatever you're drinking and bring down that viral burden. But when we aggressively treat and we get that viral burden down, there is lower risk for dementia. So that does have an impact. So if you are somebody who's ApoE44 positive and you get outbreaks, you want to never leave home without some acyclovir and be treating that the second there's prodrome. Just get super, super aggressive about it. I think that's really important. And then shingles. we see that the shingles vaccine, again, very well established in the literature. There was a great study out of the UK that was done recently that showed that people, they had basically birthdays within a month, and right in the middle, so 2 weeks before this certain date, they got the shingles vaccine. They were eligible, and there was a big public health kind of push to get all of those people born after this certain date to get the shingles vaccine, and everyone before, they didn't have access to it. They didn't get it for free, so they weren't being targeted. And they compared these two groups, basically born within a month. And 7 years later, if you had the shingles vaccine, you were 20% less likely to develop Alzheimer's. So that is a vaccine that I recommend for people over 65.
That's so interesting, because people think about it to prevent shingles, but not necessarily to prevent Alzheimer's. Did they divide the control group into people who actually had an outbreak of shingles and not, or they just saw it just across the board?
No. This was like thousands of people in the UK.
Amazing.
Yeah, this was it was everyone like under this age was getting the shingles vaccine, and everyone over wasn't. And yeah, they saw, and we see that Shingrix in the US, there was a similar study. It was like 18% less likely to be diagnosed with dementia in the years after. So I think that one's important. And then COVID is the other virus that has an effect. I think maybe people listening will be like, oh yeah, that happened to me.
Too many people.
Yeah, too many people had this experience of having COVID and then feeling like their cognition didn't recover. And we think that this is actually more structural. This is blood flow. That the cytokine storm, the cytokines that are in the bloodstream are actually creating kind of microclots that prevent blood flow and nutrient oxygen exchange. And so it's a very different mechanism than these other viruses and bacteria that are creating an immune response in the brain. But this is really more about blood flow, and how we address it is a little bit different. But that's kind of the infection conversation. And then signaling is where we'll go next.
Let's talk about signaling.
So signaling, yes, all the hormones. This is super fun. And way less controversial than it was a couple of years ago because of these new trials that have come out. There was the women over 65, the 10 million women, comparing about 1 million women on hormone replacement to the 9 million who were not, because they were products of the WHI, that generation that was pretty much denied treatment for menopausal symptoms. And, that one did not talk much about cognitive function. It actually didn't, it barely addressed it. I think it said there was a 2% reduction in dementia. I suspect that if we looked into that deeper, we would see a bigger signal. But it certainly established safety in the population over 65. Right there, with estrogen alone, there was a 19% reduction in all-cause mortality. I think I might be misquoting this, but there is certainly a reduction in breast cancer incidence in the teens, lung cancer, colon cancer, heart disease. Of course, they didn't even mention bone risk and osteoporosis in that paper, but really well, I think. It gave me a lot more confidence that we're not hurting people. And
Right.
I think in the naturopathic community, right, we've always had this sense that hormone replacement, bioidentical hormone replacement, you cannot deny that the women, postmenopausal women on hormone replacement therapy, they behave younger. They are having more sex. They are getting more exercise. They are sleeping better. They are happier, healthier people. You can just see it.
Yeah, absolutely. The quality of life improvements are unbelievable.
Life and when done correctly, right? When it's bioidentical and you have estrogen and progesterone, and you're working with patients to dial in their doses. You're never using oral estrogen. You're always using topical. I think that it's like I watch women and it's like a flower. It's like a wilted flower that just like comes to life again. It's just undeniable how beneficial it can be. And cognitively, not every woman has the same experience. For many, it's just like, okay, I can sleep again. And so now I can think again. But for others, there's this drop in cognition, my word finding, my verbal ability, my ability to put things like plan, executive function. It changed at menopause. And when we get the
Right.
estrogen back, it like a light switch, it turns back on.
Well, and I know that dementia disproportionately affects women. It's about
Mhm.
65% of patients with dementia are women. So it leads the question of, well, what is the difference? Why are women more disproportionately affected? Do you think hormones or the hormone decline during menopause or estrogen decline during menopause, is that the primary driver?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of, I mean, I'm like kind of laughing because I'm like, personally, I think it's probably the sleep deprivation associated with having an infant.
And with
Maybe
motherhood, I know
not
we can never get
motherhood.
that back, can we?
I think that might be part of it. Um, no, I think this is the big theory, right? Lisa Mosconi. There's a bunch of people talking about this, certainly these days, but for a long time. But it's this drop. Like men go through andropause, and they have this much more gradual drop in sex hormones, and women just fall off a cliff.
Mhm.
And so that is the theory. I think that there are probably, but as we do, there's multiple factors at play. It's
Well, you
probably
also
not.
think about stress. If it's stress is a big driver, you think about, nowadays, especially the women who are being monitored in these studies, it's probably the first generation of women who had jobs while child rearing. And,
Mhm.
you're seeing this change that we are classic multitaskers. I'll just leave it at that and put it in a positive sense, carrying the load, keeping everything in the air, all the balls in the air for decades.
Yeah. Mhm. I
Not
think
that men
that's
are not doing that. If you're a man listening, this is not a male bashing podcast.
no.
Just let's, just taking a minute here to honor all that additional workload that, working parents have and women as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think that there's probably multiple factors. Women also serve as caregivers, and caregiving increases risk. Now it increases risk the most for men, but I think that also is a piece of this. I think that there's multiple at play, but certainly
Mm.
the signaling is a big one. Other signals to think about. So thyroid hormone, thyroid's a hormone, vitamin D is a hormone, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor is a signal. Peptides are signals going to the brain. So what really, like at a high level, the signaling conversation is if our brain, if our neurons, like microglia, right, are activated, if the signal is to attack, defend, if you're in a fight, flight, freeze state, if you literally, like if you are personally, and then if your cells are as well, and they're in attack, defend mode, you are not making new connections between synapses,
Mm.
right? To create new synapses, new connections between them, to between neurons, we need to be in a rest, digest, heal, regenerate, connect state. And the way we get there is ultimately through signaling, right? Cortisol, having enough nutrients, getting rid of the toxins and getting rid of the infections, but then also sending those signals like all of the sex hormones and neurotransmitters. All of these things need to be in that homeodynamic balance that supports regeneration and healing.
Mm.
And so, oh, go ahead.
Oh, did you see that study I think came out in Nature earlier this year that looked at, it was predominantly a mouse study, but it had some human elements. And one of the things that they saw was that they looked at ovaries in younger women and then ovaries in postmenopausal women. And what they found was that there was this entire network of sympathetic nerves that innervated the ovaries later on in life. They believed that it was due to exposures of chronic stress over life, that actually the ovaries had a unique concentration of additional new innervation by sympathetic nervous system, and that it actually impacted the ovarian aging, which is just such an interesting thing when you look at stress and hormone connection. This is obviously very early, just observational data, but it aligns with what we see clinically, doesn't it? That we see fertility decline under stress, but when you think about the impact that the ovaries have on a woman's overall aging, because if you delay the onset of menopause, let's say 5 years or 10 years, well within the window of normal for women. Some women go through menopause earlier, some later. The ones who go through later generally fare better because they've had a longer exposure to their natural production of estrogen. So it's just such an interesting thing. You're making me think about that, and probably impactful on the brain as well, because you get that hormone cycling for a longer period of time. But that direct effect of that signaling of stress, that the physiological changes that we're starting to uncover are incredible.
Yeah, no, I hadn't seen that, but it makes a
I'll
ton
send it
of
to you.
sense.
I'll
Yeah.
put it in the show notes too for you guys that are listening. It's really cool. There's some beautiful images.
Yeah, I
beautiful and
think,
scary.
when women go through menopause, hot flashes are a very, very common symptom, right, of low estrogen. Well, our temperature set point is in the brain, right? Like to think that we don't have estrogen receptors in the brain is like, I mean, it's just nonsensical. That's a non-starter.
Right.
We have so many estrogen, progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, testosterone receptors in the brain. And testosterone in particular, right, is growth. It is signaling growth. These hormones are yeah, they're signaling connection. And right, if we think about kind of our hormones are peaking around 18, 19, 20, and not that we have to go back there, but like that is when we are learning our trade. We're connecting socially. We are like just so open to that. And so we want to make sure our brain is getting that signaling, not necessarily at that level, but we don't go to zero. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah.
Now, I have a question for you on hormone therapy for women who have a higher risk of cognitive decline. One of the things that we found really interesting when our team was digging into that research, which I think the jury's still out. It's like not conclusive, the role of HRT in cognitive decline. You said the same thing earlier. We know it's safe, but we don't know if it can reverse cognitive decline, slow cognitive decline. Like the larger studies aren't there for that yet. So I want to be clear about that. But the one thing that I found was really interesting was they've compared cyclic progesterone to continuous progesterone on protocols. Can you speak to like what you're using in practice and why? Because I think that's one thing that, if you're a practitioner or even a patient and you're worried about cognitive decline, the data on this is really fascinating. I've heard some people kind of theorize as to why that is, but love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think I can tell you what I use in clinical practice, and some of this is just pragmatic. I am not aware of data that really cleanly defines this, and there are definitely opinions out there.
Yeah.
So I was talking to Felice Gersh recently, and she is a fan of keeping women cycling. She uses much higher doses. It gets expensive, and she's using rectal suppositories of progesterone, and not everybody's open to doing that. So I think, but she has this wonderful point of like, well, if we're going to approximate what we were doing before menopause, why wouldn't we continue having women cycle? And so there's this idea that, and what the way I was trained and the way that I learned from Tori Hudson, I'm sure like most of us. And so I do more or less what she trained me to do to this day, with some nuances. And certainly I adjust it to the woman in front of me. Like what works for her? Does she need to sleep? And if so, then progesterone, because I think some of, even Felice is like, well, if you are giving progesterone, you might as well be giving a benzo. I don't know that I would go that far,
Right.
but for a woman who's not sleeping and hasn't slept since she was 50 years old, like if I can get her 200 milligrams of progesterone and get her sleeping through the night, her cognition is better, her life is better, and do I need to convince her to do an expensive rectal suppository? I don't know if I can. I don't know if she's open to that. Right. So I think navigating some of that is part of what we do. Having women take 5 days off a month, if they haven't had a bleed in years and now I've got to work them up for endometrial cancer, that opens a whole can of worms that scares them, that might turn them off, and then now they're not getting the benefits of sleep and mood and everything else potentially. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's risks and benefits and trade-offs, and it depends on the woman in front of you. But what I typically do at this stage is a patch because it's easy. I start with a 0.05 Monday and Thursday. And if that works for them, fantastic. If not, that's okay too. I've done estrogen progesterone creams. I did for a long time. They're more expensive. They're more hassle. Most of the women I talk to are not sleeping great. If they're sleeping great, I can put them on an estrogen progesterone cream, bias cream, and progesterone, and that's fantastic. Love that. Love doing that. But if someone's not sleeping, then the oral progesterone just gets them better sleep. So yeah. And then testosterone, I do usually like 2 milligrams a day. Start there. Not everybody loves it. Some people never want to let go of it. So it just depends on the woman. That there's a lot of, I love in our medicine that we have this, that there's not a one size fits all, that we can make it work.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know Dr. Gersh, I haven't spoken to her about this personally, but I know that recently she's been talking a lot about, and we should get her back on the podcast to talk about this. I'd love to have a conversation with her. But her concern is the oral micronized progesterone given orally. That's why she's doing these rectal suppositories. The other interesting thing that I've seen, and I just tried to pull a paper, and all I can find is like a 2010 mouse study, but one found that cycling progesterone, kind of on your standard protocol of like patch plus oral micronized progesterone. We're not talking about high doses or rectal. This is kind of more of the traditional protocols. They'd seen that the cycling progesterone had better outcomes cognitively than continuous. And the theory behind it was that it's really the estradiols that are so protective in the brain, even though progesterone's a neurosteroid and has like all these additional benefits, and the metabolites of progesterone are great neurosteroids. But that from a cognitive perspective, it's the estrogen that's really beneficial. So having 2 weeks where it's estrogen only gives better exposure to the estrogen receptors in the brain compared to when they're co-prescribed, where progesterone, although it's a different receptor, they have this kind of balancing act. So you have that's kind of the theory behind it that I've heard. And if I can find the papers, I will pull and drop them in here in the show notes.
Yeah,
I know one of our docs, we have them pulled somewhere because we've been chatting about it.
Just in my conversations with Felice, I'm really open to changing how we do it. I think pulsing progesterone, you're going to end up with more bleeding. So are you going to biopsy everybody?
That's right. I mean, there's ups and downs to it, right?
Yeah.
So you end up having, sometimes women bleed with the progesterone withdrawal.
And the stress of being told you might have endometrial cancer and you need to go get a biopsy. That, I mean, maybe if as a society that becomes just kind of normal, like, oh, I gotta get my uterus biopsied, like, because I'm bleeding again. Or we decide that if you're gonna cycle, like, women might have spotting in their 60s. I think that we we prepare people for that, but then are you gonna miss some endometrial cancer?
Yeah.
I don't know.
What I love about this conversation right now is you guys are getting a window into like how doctors think when we're talking about how to make clinical decisions. It's never a straight answer, and this is why we say decisions should be made on an individual basis, because it impacts the decisions that we make.
I had a patient not that long ago who came into me. I think she was at Kaiser. I shouldn't say that out loud. But she was on progesterone 1 week a year. He had her on oral estrogen and progesterone for 1 week a year.
So just 1 week.
Yep.
And did she get a withdrawal bleed and that felt that was enough?
No, but I thought she might have endometrial cancer. I was like, there's not one right way to do it.
Yeah, but there are wrong ways to do it. So yeah, I think it's important to just make sure, particularly when you're talking about HRT, we say this all the time, but you've got to be using doses that are proven to be safe and effective to prevent endometrial hyperplasia and endometrial cancer. I don't want to get too far off the topic there, but it's just really, it's very important on those protocols because it's a completely preventable concern. So I want to shift gears a little bit because we did talk so much about all of these contributing factors. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about like your clinical approach. And one thing that we mentioned briefly in your bio is that you have an outpatient clinic, but there's also an inpatient opportunity. And I'd love to hear more about how that came about, what your experience is for patients, and why you've created that route to care versus an outpatient only. So can we start with, I want people to kind of understand the patient experience.
Yeah. So I see patients at Solceres, like Solutions for the Cerebrum is kind of where that's coming from. The URL was also available. So Solceres is my outpatient clinic, and actually I feel really excited about that right now because we have just hired a couple of nurse practitioners, and we are going to start taking Medicare for this Bredesen approach, which is really excited. So with the GUIDE program, GUIDE is a program through Medicare that helps with care coordination, and then through the nurse practitioners, we're hoping we can really bring this naturopathic Bredesen-based approach to people struggling with dementia and Alzheimer's, because people walking into my clinic, seeing myself or my colleague, Dr. Rachel Husner, for the past few years, they're going to have to spend $10,000 by the time they see us, pay for the labs, get the supplements. And if we can reduce the cost, we make this approach much more accessible to so many more people. So that is our current project that we are really, really, really excited about. And so May of 2026, those 2 new nurse practitioners will be seeing patients at Solsari. And then we will as well, of course, but we can't bill Medicare, so it'll continue to be cash-based. And then Marama is the residential care community that I created. And essentially this came out of like everything. It's like patients asking, hey, my uncle has been diagnosed with dementia. I want him to get Dr. Bredeson's approach, but where do I send him? I'm, like we were talking about women, right? I've got my dog and my kids and my career and my husband and my house to manage. Like I can't do this for my uncle. So where do I send him? And in 2019, I thought to myself, well, how hard could it be? Nobody else is doing this. Why don't we just create one? And so we did, and it was successful in many ways, and it was also extremely stressful for me. And so I have since shut that down. I mean, it was amazing. People came, we had a controlled environment, we fed them organic keto food, and we had them engaged in cognitive activities and in community, and it was in a non-toxic environment. I mean, we had organic mattresses and there was no mold in that place. So we ran air filters, we got them outside. I mean, there was this beautiful garden on the property. It was great. It was amazing. People got better. What happened was there were many reasons why we wound it down. It was extremely stressful for me to be responsible for people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week who were
I can imagine.
risk for falls. Yeah. And all of the other things. It was a lot. And it was so well worth it. We learned so much about what works and what doesn't, and the complexities and the dynamics of that stage of life and those decisions. And it, one of the things that we learned was that people waited, right? Because if you need to send your mom to San Diego from Maryland, she's got to be pretty far gone for you to feel that desperate. And I think that we can have a bigger impact, and the conversation is now happening in a way that it wasn't in 2019 in larger senior living communities. So what I do now is I basically consult with some of these larger groups that have assisted and independent living and then some small memory care. They don't have enough capacity in memory care. So they end up with a lot of people in assisted and independent living who have significant cognitive changes, who are looking for resources. And so my goal is to essentially help them create programs that prevent people from going into memory care versus waiting for people to come to us when they're so late stage. We can get people with MOCAs of 0 improved.
Wow.
It blew my mind, but we don't want to. We want to keep people from getting there to begin with.
I mean, that brings up a really important point, which is like, what's the right time to intervene?
Oh, in utero. Right? Like, I mean,
that's the best. Okay. And I see the same thing with fertility. I think about that where the biggest impact you could have is like when you're in your mother's womb. And sometimes we're dealing with, exposures that can't be undone because they were before you had control of the situation. But
it's never too early. Like, right.
I love that.
Tree, when is the best time to plant a tree? It's like, if there's nothing, you can't go backwards, but like today.
And so give me your practical advice for the average, let's say woman in her 30s. What should she be focused on?
Sleep. Yeah, I mean, the foundations are, of course, like anything else: diet, exercise, lifestyle, stress management, and rest. Get 8 hours of sleep a night. Get an aura, track your sleep, understand what helps you get good sleep. Sleep is the number one way to protect your brain. And then the next is exercise. And then the next is the metabolic flexibility. Get in and out of ketosis. Have periods of fasting. Manage your weight. Manage your blood sugar. We could talk about GLP-1s. I don't know if you want to.
Let's talk about GLP-1s. Yeah.
We use them when appropriate. There was a study where they tried to see if GLP-1s would reduce Alzheimer's risk, and it did not. However, I do think that in the right patient who's struggling with weight management, who is struggling with metabolic flexibility, who's maybe knocking on the door of diabetes, who has some insulin resistance, who has inflammation, whose HSCRP is elevated, that is a great candidate for GLP-1s. And I think that overall her risk will be reduced, or his risk will be reduced for developing all kinds of chronic diseases as we age. And so I think that there is a right time to use that tool. Of course, with exercise and good nutrition, getting plenty of protein, getting plenty of macros and micronutrients. But I think as opposed to, a bariatric surgery or something, this is a really, really great option that we have to mitigate a lot of the risks associated with the diseases of aging.
One thing we haven't talked about today, and your thoughts on GLP-1 make me think about this, because we make our microbiome kind of makes our own natural GLP-1s, right? These peptides come predominantly from our gut that influence our hunger. Has there been studies on GI function and dementia in any way, or what are your thoughts about that? Is that something that's important to address?
Yeah, gut-brain connection, absolutely. And then also just going back to nutrients, right? I kind of put this in the nutrient category. We talked about macro and micros, but it's like you can choose to eat all the best stuff, but if you can't digest and absorb it, then that doesn't help very much. So without a doubt, we run a stool test on every single person we see. We're looking for markers of digestive function, and then also, of course, with their symptoms, we're going to kill bugs that are overgrown, protozoa and candida and bacteria. So certainly we're doing lots of that, replenishing with the good guys, getting inflammation down. I use, BPC and liraglutide regularly to help people with gut, with leaky gut, the liraglutide is very helpful for sensitivities to gluten. We don't really promote a gluten-rich diet, but just in terms of reducing sensitivities, we see great benefit with that, reducing inflammation with BPC and increasing gut function. Yeah, we do the naturopathic bread and butter of gut function for sure. Don't leave that out.
Well, I love that you're tackling this. And as a naturopathic doctor, I feel so much kind of pride that you're in this tribe and having so much success. And really kind of making such a big impact in this field, because it's one that, like I said, it impacts so many people. It puts a huge economic strain on our healthcare system, and just an emotional strain and financial strain on families as they care for elders that are going through this. So I'm just so grateful for the approach and all the time you've spent to develop expertise and to help people in this area. I feel like I could keep asking you questions. There's so many things I want to know, all these trending things, hyperbaric oxygen therapy and sauna and all these things, how do these layer in and how important are they or not, or how impactful they are not. So we're going to have you back.
Happy to, anytime. Yes, all of the trendy, fun. Well, although we were learning about cold plunges in school, right? Before it was cool. But yes, I have a book. There's lots more about all that stuff in the book, but happy to share anytime with you. It's such a pleasure.
Well, please share with listeners how they can follow you and kind of keep you in their orbit on social. Tell us about your book. We'll make sure we link to everything in the show notes for you guys.
Yeah, so drheathersandison.com. You can join my newsletter on Instagram. I'm dr.heathersandison, Sandison. And then my book is called Reversing Alzheimer's. It's available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And happy to support. We've got coaching programs, online coaching programs for people who are not in California. We are taking new patients in California. And then happy to connect anyone with referrals in the senior living space.
Well, thanks again for all the work you do. And it's making a huge impact on your community. It's pretty impressive.
Thank you, Jaclyn.
Yeah, and thank you, all of you who've been listening today. I hope you found the conversation to be as fabulous as I did. I wanted to remind you, if you like conversations like this and you want to learn more about hormone therapy and Dutch testing and root cause medicine, we do release a podcast every single Tuesday. So make sure you subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and follow us on socials at Dutch Test. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks for joining us on the Dutch Podcast. Join us every Tuesday for new conversations with leading functional health experts. If you like what you've heard, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.